Nashville, Tennessee, spring 1965, Studio B on Music Row. A cramped basement session room that smelled like cigarettes, old carpet, and broken dreams. The walls were covered in cheap acoustic foam, peeling at the edges. A single overhead light buzzed intermittently. This wasn't the Nashville of the Grand Ole Opry. This was the Nashville where black musicians cut records in basements after the real studios closed. Jimi Hendrix sat in the corner with his Stratocaster, waiting. He was 22 years old and invisible. Not the Jimi Hendrix who would set guitars on fire at Monterey Pop. Not the Jimi Hendrix whose face would be on magazine covers. Just another black session guitarist grinding through the Chitlin circuit, picking up work wherever he could find it. The session that night was for a local R&B act trying to cut a single. The kind of record that might get played on a few regional stations if they were lucky. The bandleader, a man named Curtis who ran weekend gigs at the clubs on Jefferson Street, had hired Jimi for $15. Play rhythm guitar, don't solo unless asked, don't talk unless spoken to. Jimi was good at being invisible. He'd learned that skill working behind Little Richard, behind the Isley Brothers, behind Wilson Pickett. Stay in the pocket. Don't draw attention. Cash the check. Move to the next town. 6 months earlier, Little Richard had told him, "You play too loud, young blood. I'm the star. You're the backing band." Jimi had nodded, turned his amp down, and kept playing. That's how it worked. No matter how good you were, if you were holding the guitar and someone else was holding the microphone, you knew your place. The session wasn't going well. They'd been trying to record the lead vocal for 3 hours. The singer, a kid barely 19 with processed hair and a sharkskin suit, couldn't find the melody. He'd start strong, then crack on the high notes. Or he'd nail the verse and fall apart on the bridge. Take after take, the tape kept rolling and nothing stuck. The producer, a white man in his 40s named Jack Miller, who owned the studio, was losing patience. He sat behind the mixing board, arms crossed, jaw tight. Miller had a reputation. He worked fast, didn't waste tape, and had no tolerance for unprepared talent. "Again," Miller said through the talkback mic. His voice was flat, exhausted. The singer tried again. His voice wavered on the second line. He stopped mid-verse, shook his head. "I can't hit it," the singer said, his voice small through the monitor. "The key's too high." "We already changed the key twice," Miller said. "That's the arrangement. That's what we're cutting." Curtis, the bandleader, stood near the control room window, watching his payday evaporate. He'd invested his own money in this session. If they didn't finish tonight, there was no budget to come back. "Take 5, Miller announced. "Everybody out." The band filed into the control room. The singer sat on an amp, head down. Nobody spoke. The room had that particular silence that happens when a project is dying, and everyone knows it, but nobody wants to say it out loud. Jimi stayed where he was in the corner, guitar across his lap. He strummed softly, running through the chord changes, not because anyone was listening, but because that's what he did. He played constantly, even when nobody was paying attention. Miller lit a cigarette and stared at the 2-inch tape reels. 3 hours of failed takes. He did the math in his head. Studio time, tape costs, musicians, money evaporating with every minute. Curtis paced near the wall. "Maybe we try it lower. Drop it a full step." "Won't help," Miller said. "Kid can't sing. Not at this level. He's nervous. Give him another. I've given him 20 takes. He doesn't have it." The bassist, an older session player named Raymond, who'd worked with everyone from Ray Charles to Etta James, spoke quietly. "Maybe someone else sings it." Curtis looked around the room. "Who?" Raymond shrugged. "Anybody. You sing it, Curtis. You got a voice." "I can't sing like that," Curtis said. "That's not my style." Miller exhaled smoke toward the ceiling. He was done. This session was over. He'd cut his losses, keep the deposit, move on to the next project. But something in him resisted giving up completely. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was curiosity. He looked at the band through the control room glass, the drummer scrolling a magazine, the bassist tuning, and Jimi in the corner, fingers moving on the fretboard, playing something that wasn't the song they were supposed to be recording. Something prettier. Miller leaned forward. "Who's that? Corner." "That's Jimmy," Curtis said. "Guitar player." "He sing?" Curtis hesitated. "Don't know. He's here to play guitar." Miller's mouth curved into something close to a smile. Not a kind smile. A tired, cynical, what the hell why not smile. "Let the guitar player sing it," Miller said. Curtis thought he was joking. "Jimmy? Sure, why not?" Miller's voice carried that edge of someone who'd stopped caring about outcomes. "We're already dead in the water. Let's see if the guitar player can do better than the actual singer." Raymond caught the tone. He'd heard it before. The moment when a producer stops trying to make something good and starts trying to entertain himself. Make the guitar player sing. See him fail. Get a story to tell at the bar later. Curtis walked into the tracking room. Jimmy was still playing, eyes closed, lost in whatever he was hearing in his head. "Jimmy," Curtis said, "Miller wants you to try the vocal." Jimmy's fingers stopped. He looked up. "What?" "The lead. Sing it." Jimmy's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Not fear exactly, more like recognition. He'd been in this position before. The joke, the setup. Put the backing musician in the spotlight, watch him fold. "I don't sing," Jimmy said quietly. "Just try it," Curtis said. "For me. One take." Jimmy set his guitar down and stood. He walked to the microphone in the center of the room. The real singer watched from the corner, relieved to be out of the hot seat, maybe a little curious. Jimmy adjusted the mic stand. He didn't look at the control room, didn't make eye contact with anyone. He just stood there, waiting. Miller pressed the talk back. "You know the song?" "Heard it 20 times tonight," Jimmy said. "Key of E?" "Yeah." Miller hit record without ceremony. The tape started rolling. The band kicked in. Drums, bass, Jimmy's rhythm guitar track from earlier bleeding through the headphones. Jimmy started singing. His voice wasn't powerful. It wasn't technically perfect. It wasn't the kind of voice that would make vocal coaches applaud. But it had something else. Something the kid in the sharkskin suit didn't have. It had truth. Jimmy sang like he was alone in a room at 3 in the morning, working through something personal. His phrasing was unconventional, sliding behind the beat on some lines, pushing ahead on others. He bent notes the way he bent guitar strings, making the melody his own. His tone was warm, slightly raspy, vulnerable in a way that made you lean in to hear. He didn't perform the song. He inhabited it. The control room went silent. Raymond stopped tuning. Curtis stopped pacing. Miller leaned back in his chair, cigarette forgotten in the ashtray. Jimmy sang the first verse straight. The second verse, he started adding small variations. A vocal run here, a sustained note there. Nothing flashy, nothing that called attention to itself. But every choice felt inevitable. Like that's how the song had always been meant to sound. When he hit the bridge, the part that had broken the original singer every time, Jimmy's voice opened up. Not loud, just fuller. He held the high note, not with force but with control, letting it ring until it naturally decayed. The song ended. Jimmy stood at the mic, eyes still closed, finishing the last line like he was completing a thought he'd been holding for years. Nobody moved. The bassist had stopped tuning mid-string. The drummer's cigarette burned forgotten in his fingers. Curtis stood frozen near the wall, one hand still raised from whatever gesture he'd been making when Jimmy started singing. Miller sat perfectly still behind the console, staring at the VU meters as they settled back to zero. He'd produced hundreds of sessions, R&B, country, gospel, rockabilly. He knew the difference between adequate and good. He knew the difference between good and special. What he'd just heard was special. The tape reel kept spinning in silence. Miller hit the talkback. His voice was different now, quieter. "That's the take." Jimmy opened his eyes. "You want another one?" "No, that's it. We're done." Curtis exhaled. The session was saved. The tape had something usable, maybe even something good. But Miller wasn't thinking about the session anymore. He was thinking about the voice he'd just heard, the voice that came out of the guitar player he'd asked to sing as a joke. Jimmy walked back to the corner, picked up his Stratocaster, sat down, like nothing had happened. The band packed up. Curtis paid everyone in cash. $15 for Jimmy, same as agreed. Nobody said much, Musicians have a superstition about talking too much after a good take, like you might jinx it. Jimi left the studio around 2 a.m., walked back to the boarding house where he was staying, put his guitar in the corner, laid down on the thin mattress, stared at the ceiling. He'd done what they asked, sang when they told him to sing, saved their session, but the way Miller had said it, let the guitar player sing it, like it was a punchline. That stayed with him. Years later, when Jimi became Jimi Hendrix, when RU experience changed rock music, when Purple Haze and The Wind Cries Mary were on every radio station, people would ask him about his voice. Critics would review his vocal performances. Some loved his singing. Some said he couldn't sing, that he was just a guitar player. And Jimi always agreed with the critics. "I'm not a singer," he'd say in interviews. "I'm a guitar player who sings because nobody else will." His producers would push back, tell him his voice was unique, distinctive, perfect for his songs. But Jimi wouldn't hear it. He'd spend hours in the studio, redoing vocal takes, convinced they weren't good enough. He'd talk about finding a real singer for the band, someone who could handle the vocals while he focused on guitar. Chas Chandler, his manager, once asked him about it. They were in a London studio in 1967, and Jimi had just finished recording the vocals for The Wind Cries Mary in one take. Perfect performance. Emotional, controlled, beautiful. "That was brilliant," Chas said. Jimi shook his head. "I can't sing, man. Never could." "Where'd you get that idea?" Jimi didn't answer immediately. He adjusted his headphones, played with a cable. Outside the control room window, the engineer was rewinding tape, getting ready for the next song. The studio smelled like coffee and old wood paneling. Then quietly, "Just something I know." Chas waited. He learned that with Jimi, you didn't push. You let silence do the work. "First time someone asked me to sing," Jimi said finally, still not looking at Chas. "It was supposed to be funny. Like, let's see if the guitar player can do it. Let's watch him fail." "Did you fail?" "No." "Then what's the problem?" Jimi smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "The joke was that I tried." The truth was deeper. Jimi could write guitar parts that redefined what the instrument could do. He could play with a level of innovation that made other guitarists question everything they knew. But when it came to his voice, he heard that control room in Nashville. He heard Jack Miller's tone. Let the guitar player sing it. The joke. At Monterey Pop in 1967, Jimi played guitar with his teeth behind his back while humping his amplifier, and then set his Stratocaster on fire. The performance became legendary. But before he went on stage, he told his band, "I'll do the tricks. That's what they came for. The guitar stuff, nobody cares about the singing." "They care about everything you do," Mitch Mitchell, his drummer, said. Jimi didn't believe it. He was standing side stage, watching 60,000 people waiting. "What if my voice cracks?" he asked. "Man, your voice is perfect for your songs," Mitch said. "It's not a real voice," Jimi said. "Not like a real singer." Then he walked on stage and the crowd roared, and Jimi became the showman. But even while he was setting his guitar on fire, part of him was listening to his vocals, hearing every flaw. In September 1970, Jimi Hendrix died in London. He was 27 years old. In his last interview, recorded just days before his death, a journalist asked about his future plans. "I want to focus more on guitar," Jimi said. "Maybe find a singer, someone who can really sing. I'm just the guitar player." The journalist laughed, thought he was being modest. But Jimi wasn't joking. In Nashville, 1965, a studio boss told a guitar player to sing as a joke. The result changed music forever. The voice that came out of Jimi Hendrix that night in Studio B became the voice of a generation. Vulnerable, honest, raw, and achingly human. But Jimi never heard it that way. He always heard the joke. And that single moment of doubt, that casual dismissal wrapped in sarcasm, followed him from small clubs to sold-out arenas, from basement studios to festival stages, from his first session to his last breath. Years after that Nashville session, Jack Miller was interviewed for a music documentary. Someone asked him if he remembered discovering Jimi Hendrix's voice. Miller looked confused. "Who?" he asked. When they explained, he vaguely recalled the session. "Oh yeah, the guitar player who sang." That was just something we tried. Didn't think much of it. He'd forgotten. The moment that defined Jimmy's insecurity for the rest of his life was so forgettable to Miller that he couldn't even place it without prompting. Just another session. Just another night. Just another joke that happened to work. Jack Miller never knew. Curtis never knew. The band never knew. Nobody knew that when they asked the guitar player to sing, they weren't just recording a vocal track. They were planting an insecurity that would outlive the man himself. Somewhere in a vault, that original recording probably still exists. Studio B, Nashville, 1965. The night Jimi Hendrix discovered he could sing, the night Jack Miller made a joke that became a prophecy. The tape captured the voice, but it didn't capture what the voice cost. Jimi Hendrix could play guitar like a god, but he died believing he couldn't sing because it started as a joke, and he never forgot.